Imagine this: 200 years ago, on the shores of Canton, wooden ships flying the British flag pulled into port. On board, they weren't carrying gold or cutting-edge machines, but wooden chests packed with opium, a brown powder that would drown an empire of hundreds of millions in smoke. Back then, Britain was the rising superpower. China was the sick man of Asia. Opium flowed one way into China, and silver flowed the other way back to London. A rising empire used addiction as an economic weapon. Today, you're sitting in a town somewhere in America, Canada, or the UK. You hear about yet another young person dead from fentanyl. You see maps of US states lit up red with overdose deaths. You watch an entire generation grow up with painkillers, sleep meds, and stress relief pills as a normal part of life. And you start to wonder, has the wheel turned? Is it possible that this time, the American empire is the addict and the opium is flowing in from the outside? This is not a cheap conspiracy story. It's a pattern, one that stretches from the Opium Wars of the 19th century to fentanyl today. And you, your family, your wealth, and your health are all standing in the line of fire. Back then, Britain had a big problem. They were addicted to Chinese tea. The middle class, the elites, the bureaucrats, everyone drank tea. Tea, silk, porcelain, all of it had to be bought from China. But China didn't need anything from Britain. They didn't want British wool, British factory goods, or British progress. China would only accept one thing: silver. Every year, millions of pounds worth of silver slowly flowed into the Qing treasury. For a rising industrial empire, that was like blood draining from the body. You know that feeling at a personal level, money leaving your account with no new income replacing it? For a country, that's a trade deficit. For a middle-aged worker, it's debt and a shrinking retirement account. Britain wasn't willing to accept that. They looked for a way to flip the script. They couldn't force China to buy machines, so they chose to sell something any human finds hard to resist: addiction. Opium was grown on a massive scale in British-ruled India, backed by the state, run by merchants like the Sassoon family. They packed it into chests, loaded it onto ships, and sent it to Canton. Once people were hooked, silver stopped flowing to Beijing and started flowing back to London. That was the first big system hack, using addiction to reverse the direction of global money flows. Now think about the 21st century. You're living in a country that still calls itself a superpower. But what do you see? You see giant trade deficits with China. You see cheap goods flooding into every supermarket: phones, appliances, toys for your kids. You see public debt climbing. You hear political fights about lost jobs and dying factory towns. But there's another flow that doesn't get talked about as plainly: the flow of drugs. Fentanyl, that technical, distant-sounding name, is killing young Americans faster than war, faster than car accidents in many recent years. A substance so strong that just a few grains can take a life. A chemical born in medicine, used to ease the pain of cancer patients and surgical patients. But like opium 2 centuries ago, it walked out of the hospital, down the alley, into parties, warehouses, and finally the morgue. You might think, that's a problem for junkies. It has nothing to do with me. That's exactly what many Qing officials thought when opium first arrived, until they realized that their own class, officials, soldiers, merchants, were being pulled into the smoke. By the time they understood it wasn't a small group problem, it had already become a system failure. With fentanyl, the pattern is the same. It starts with vulnerable people, then spreads into towns where jobs have vanished, hope has faded, and a little pill is the cheapest way to escape reality for a few hours. To understand why fentanyl is so dangerous, you have to look at its supply chain. Unlike heroin, which needs poppy fields, soil, climate, seasons, fentanyl is a synthetic chemical. What does that mean? It means you don't need Afghan or Indian poppy fields anymore. You need a lab, precursor chemicals, and some skill. And you have something many times stronger than heroin, more compact, easier to ship, and far more profitable. Where do those precursors come from? A significant share comes from chemical factories in Asia, especially China. Not all of them are illegal. Many plants are legally registered to produce chemicals for pharmaceuticals or industry. But if just a few % of that output falls off the truck into the wrong hands, that's enough to feed the black market almost indefinitely. Those chemicals are shipped worldwide. They end up in Mexico, where the cartels are already experts at getting drugs into the United States. They mix fentanyl into heroin, into fake pills, into anything that sells on the street. Why? Because fentanyl is cheap, strong, and hooks users fast. You might say that's just crime. But remember, the Sassoons were just merchants once too. They also just bought and sold inside a legal framework someone else wrote for them. Government looked the other way. Banks processed the payments. Insurers covered the ships. Everyone took a cut. Today, with fentanyl, the pattern rhymes. Chemicals are made, shipped, and traded, sometimes fully legit on paper. Logistics companies move containers and have little incentive to scrutinize every drum of chemicals. The cash generated by fentanyl is washed through real estate, shell companies, restaurants, casinos, and yes, even parts of the formal financial system. You don't need a memo that says, let's poison Americans. You just need a chain of small incentives, profit targets, bonuses, GDP growth, export figures. Each link in the chain does its small part. Put it all together and you have a pipeline delivering a substance far stronger than old-school opium into the world's largest market. Some people say, and this is a reverse opium war, China is taking revenge on America. You've probably heard that on a podcast, on YouTube, or in a comment section. The real question is, how should you look at that claim? If you've studied the British-Chinese opium story, you see some uncomfortable parallels. Back then, Britain was running a trade deficit with China. Today, the US runs a huge trade deficit with China. Back then, Britain found a highly addictive product that could reverse the flow of silver. Today, fentanyl, precursors, and a wave of cheap products flow out of China, while money and demand flow back in the other direction. Back then, the Qing court was slow, divided, corrupt, unable or unwilling to confront the problem decisively. Today, U.S. politics is divided, stuck in arguments over immigration, borders, and global trade, but not dealing with the root despair driving people toward drugs. But there's one critical difference. The Opium Wars were official policy of a British empire. Opium was openly backed by the British state, run by the East India Company, and protected by warships. Fentanyl today, on paper, is illegal. There's no document from Beijing that says, poison Americans. It's simplistic and dangerous to swallow every China's secret war narrative without analysis. But the absence of official policy doesn't mean there is no pattern. Anything that weakens a rival, brings in money for domestic businesses, and sits in a legal and political gray zone where responsibility is hard to pin on top leaders, will always be something that someone somewhere is tempted to exploit. You don't have to believe in a grand conspiracy with a step-by-step plan. You only have to look at economic and political incentives. If a flow of goods and chemicals is killing tens of thousands of rival workers every year, generating revenue, jobs, and profits at home, and living in a legal gray area where blame is easy to dodge, then there is very little natural pressure to stop it quickly. And that is the problem. But the more important question for you is not, what is China doing to America? It's this: who is making money from keeping this crisis going? When you follow the money, the picture gets more complicated. Cartels in Mexico earn enormous margins on every gram of fentanyl. Chemical plants earn revenue selling precursors. They can always say, we just sell chemicals. We're not responsible for how they're used. Small banks, financial middlemen, and laundromats for dirty cash clean the profits through property deals, businesses, and investments. The justice system, prisons, rehab centers, and government programs, some of them genuinely trying to help, are still part of a market. They still have budgets, contracts, and jobs tied to the crisis. Just like with opium, it isn't only the Sassoons who got rich. An entire ecosystem fed off the trade. Farmers, merchants, bankers, insurers, officials. Everyone took just a small piece. Together they formed a machine. Today, fentanyl is only the most visible part. Behind it sits a healthcare system used to managing symptoms with prescriptions instead of solving root causes. An economy that often prefers giving people temporary escape over fixing the reality they're escaping from. A culture where many kinds of pain, physical, psychological, economic, are handled with a pill, a hit, a scroll, instead of community and real structural change. If you look at the decline curve of any empire, you see a hard truth. It rarely starts with losing a battle. It usually starts with rotting from the inside. For 19th century China, that rot was a population sliding into addiction, a bureaucracy falling apart, an army that couldn't fight. Port cities soaked in opium dens, productivity falling, and state finances bleeding. For America today, what you're seeing, overdoses, prime-age men leaving the labor force, rising depression, and hopelessness, are all indicators of the same kind of internal erosion. An addicted worker is not just a personal tragedy. He is a lost productive worker, a family on the edge or broken, a child growing up in chaos, a cost to healthcare, welfare, and law enforcement. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands and millions, and you have a macroeconomic burden. Your rival doesn't need to bomb you. They can let you spend your own budget on healthcare, welfare, policing, and rehab until your strength drains away. You already understand this at a personal level. When you're 40 or 50, your body isn't 20 anymore. A small bad habit, repeated for decades, turns into a serious health problem. At the empire level, fentanyl, opioids, tranquilizers, easy credit, porn, and cheap entertainment are all bad habits that accumulate and eat away at self-control. So what should you take from all this? First, every time you see a family name on a hospital wing, a university building, or a museum, pause and quietly ask, where did this money come from? Not to deny all philanthropy, but history shows you, from Sassoon to Sackler, from opium to opioids, the pattern is the same. They make money from suffering, they minimize their taxes, they wash their reputation with donations, and when it all blows up, they pay off a fraction as settlements and vanish from the headlines, leaving the next generation to enjoy clean assets. Second, don't hand over your entire physical and mental health to a system whose business model is dependency. Life-saving medicine is vital. Pain relief matters. But every time someone offers you a fast, easy, just take this everyday solution, remember opium and fentanyl. A drug that's perfectly legal today can become tomorrow's heroin 2.0. A treatment plan can quietly turn you into a customer for life. Third, every empire has its own opium for its own people. For Britain, that was cheap gin and booze flooding working-class districts, while opium went to China. For America, it's prescription opioids, fentanyl, and also cheap credit, endless entertainment, and digital addictions that keep people quiet and numb. If you can't identify the opium of your own era, chances are you're already using it. Fourth, when a crisis drags on for years and never really gets fixed, follow the money. Don't just listen to speeches on TV. Who's signing contracts to build more prisons? Who's selling more antidote drugs? Who's running upscale rehab chains? Who's lobbying for anti-drug budgets that never touch the root causes, economic despair, social isolation, and a generation that no longer believes in its own future? Fifth, don't wait for the system to wake up. History is blunt. Systems only repent after they've extracted the maximum value from a cycle of addiction. The Qing court woke up after it had already lost a century. Britain apologized for the Opium Wars long after the ships were loaded with gold. Apologies always come after most of the victims are in the ground. At the personal level, that means you have to wake up before the doctor, the insurance company, the pharma CEO, or the politician says, "We were wrong." You have to protect your kids from the next wave of addiction, not just white powder in a syringe, but pills, vape, screens, and debt. You have to stop looking at funded by plaques with naive eyes. 50 years from now, there will probably be a documentary on some platform you've never heard of titled something like Fentanyl Wars, How the 21st Century Opium War Weakened America. They'll show black and white images of hollowed-out factory towns, shuttered plants, young people lying dead on bathroom floors with a little bottle or pill beside them. They'll talk about corporations, banks, politicians, border officials who didn't do enough, who didn't see it coming. They'll mention a wave of grants, charities, and hospital wings funded by people who made money somewhere in that chain. And then they'll do what history always does to victims, compress them into numbers on a chart. The question is, when those numbers are written, will you be watching that history or lying inside it as one more data point? You can't single-handedly rewrite U.S. politics, shut down chemical plants overseas, or dismantle the global drug trade. But you can. Look honestly at how you use drugs, alcohol, credit, and entertainment. Have real conversations with your kids about addiction, pain, and not running from it with chemicals. Stop seeing big donor names as automatic symbols of virtue. Opium once turned China into the sick man of Asia. Fentanyl is pushing America toward a different image, a rich but exhausted empire, armed to the teeth on the outside, filled with millions of citizens who no longer believe in their own future on the inside. An empire doesn't start collapsing when its currency dips on a chart. It starts collapsing when men in their prime working years, men like you, begin losing the ability to say no to small pills and sweet promises like, just one more dose and everything will feel okay. History shows you the pattern. Whether you use that pattern to wake up before you become part of it, that choice is yours.